Chapter 1. It was ironic, maybe even a little funny, that every decision the agent had ever made in his entire life led to the two choices now before him. He sat at the table in the kitchen nook of his small apartment. The blinds were pulled tight, shutting out a gorgeous bright morning. The sweaty palms of both his hands lay flat atop the surface of the table. Above his left hand lay his service revolver. Above his right hand lay his cell phone. He closed his eyes. Irony is that either choice could be viewed as either bravery or cowardice. On the surface, putting a bullet to his head would take guts. The mere thought of metal blasting into his skull made his heart shiver. The pain would be intensely brutal, if only for a second. It was the thought of that second that gave him pause. Of course, after his body was discovered and people later found out what he'd done, they'd all say that he had taken the cowardly way out. No one would give him credit for withstanding that one brutal second. The funny thing was, if he chose the latter option, it could eventually lead to him having to face the legal system. That could result in a lengthy prison sentence, but not the death he was so strongly contemplating now, which would anger the very people who would cry foul if he committed suicide. There was no pleasing some folk. Of course, that option also meant continuing on as he had the past 17 years, letting father continue to control every aspect of his life. It would mean making a call to father and giving the old man the information he'd requested. It was cowardly not standing up to father, not facing the music in the here and now, but it was surely an act of bravery to know that not putting a bullet into his own head today would ensure that one day he would have to publicly acknowledge his past misdeeds. Sooner or later, the agent would face the music. One day soon, he would have to confess to God and everyone else all he'd done. That day would require great courage, all he'd be able to muster up. His heart trembled at the thought. He squeezed his eyes closed tighter, and then his life flashed before him. He saw his mother in all her maternal splendor, and his father, who was once there, then was gone, and then was there again. He saw his brothers, all of whom had been much older than he. It had always been as if he didn't really have any brothers at all. Then again, there was Ben Loverson. Ben had been a friend, a best friend, a blood brother. The relationship had been thicker than any blood connection. It had been years since the agent had last seen him. It was even longer since the agent's love and admiration for his blood brother had suddenly returned to envious thoughts and hatred. The agent quickly pushed that memory away, only to have it replaced with another painful one, father's house. Then he wondered if it was better to live in a house with invisible yet obstructive walls, or if it was better to be trapped in a house where you could see the walls of your limitations. If one successfully, albeit unknowingly, navigated through a house with invisible walls, one would still have the sense of being free. But in a house with thick, visible walls and locked doors, one would surely know that he was not free. Blissful ignorance akin to freedom. Today, the answer seemed so obvious. Trapped was trapped. And one day, Ben Leveson would see the obvious. One day, he was going to hit a wall and then realize just how trapped he'd been. At that time, maybe the agent would get his blood brother back. Shared pain always brought people together. Maybe then the two of them could figure out a way to get beyond the walls. That was, of course, if finding out the agent's most atrocious act didn't provoke Leveson to kill him first. Anyway, he had finally reached a decision. He sighed, opened his eyes, and then, after wiping his clammy right hand across the front of his shirt, he picked up the cell phone. Malik Jackson's breath was lodged in the middle of his throat like cornered wind trapped inside a balloon. He stood motionless at the top of the basement steps, staring into the blackness at the just slammed basement door. He listened intently, trying to determine if Uncle Mayo was still on the other side of the door. He could hear nothing, he could see nothing. No sound, total darkness, and no Uncle Mayo. Despite his fear, he wasn't totally surprised with his current predicament. He'd expected the old man to do something. After all, Uncle Mayo had warned him about the drugs. But Malik hadn't expected this, whatever this was. What type of punishment did the old man have in mind? Slowly, his breathing returned. He swallowed hard, turned around shakily, and then proceeded down a couple of stairs into the darkness. There, he paused again and looked back up at the basement door. He could barely make out the outline of it as it disappeared into the darkness. Moments before, Uncle Mayo had pushed him into the basement, the door quickly snapping shut behind him as if its hinges were taut rubber bands. He sucked in a long, nervous, deep breath. Once again, he turned his head back toward the basement floor. He goose-necked forward, trying to peer beyond the darkened stairwell. After another breathless moment of indecision and uncertainty, he decided it was probably best to just keep moving. Haltingly, he continued downward. Drugs are dangerous was a refrain that he'd heard 1,000 times before, at school, on TV, and here at Father's house, a place where, ironically, most of his young inhabitants had more than a passing familiarity with most illicit drugs. Malik had been under no illusions when he had chosen his new career path. He'd seen firsthand the ill side effects of the drugs, but users and dealers generally accepted the high risk, high reward nature of the drug trade. For Malik, it had been no different, even if it had meant jeopardizing his stay at Father's house. He had lived under the Father's house roof for the past 6 months and had been a regular participant in the house's after school program 18 months before that. There were 7 other boys that also lived at the house, and another 18 in his after school program. As far as Malik could tell, at least 4 of the house residents dabbled in the drug trade, and unless the old man was totally clueless to the obvious, which Malik seriously doubted, those 4 had apparently been given a pass that wasn't being afforded to Malik. "I don't want you doing drugs," the old man had said to Malik on more than one occasion. "You know what drugs did to your mama." It had been a needless reminder. Of course Malik knew what drugs had done to his mama. He'd been there. He'd suffered through it. But his mama had been a user, not a seller. 11-year-old Malik understood the difference. In the drug game, you were either a taker or a giver. Users were givers. His mama had given all she had, including her body and ultimately her life, to the drug game. But Malik had no intentions of using drugs. He was going to be a taker. He was going to make that money. He needed to make that money. However, he had to admit to himself that he hated disappointing Uncle Mayo. The old man had been good to him. Malik truly believed that Uncle Mayo only wanted what he thought was best for Malik. Maybe that was why he had been tougher on Malik than those other boys. But Malik had been born with his eyes wide open to the real world. In the real world, money was might, and might made right. In the real world, a safe penny ante job wasn't going to cut it. It wasn't as if Malik hadn't considered all his options. He had, but in his mind there were few, if any. He couldn't sing, he couldn't rap, so child stardom was definitely a pipe dream. And as for society's favorite, staying in school and getting a quality education, well, that only represented an even chance to potentially earn more than the minimum wage. And even if he wanted one of those so-called respectable jobs, he'd most likely need to go to college to land one. Going to college would cost money, and not to mention years away. He needed money now, lots of it. Drugs equaled now money. With it, he could pay back Uncle Mayo for all he'd done for him, and more importantly, he could get his grandfather's farm back. He reached the halfway point and paused again, dreading what he might find at the bottom of the steps. He had expected Uncle Mayo to do something drastic after the police had released him into the old man's custody. As far as he knew, none of the other boys had ever been snatched up by the popo. That he had was probably justification enough for the old man to exact some form of punishment. It had crossed Malik's mind that the old man may have considered giving him an old-fashioned whipping, or simply kicked him out of father's house altogether, hurling Malik into a careless child care system. But now it didn't appear as if either of those things was going to happen. The old man hadn't even looked very upset when he picked Malik up from the police station. Not a word was shared between the two of them the whole ride home. And when they got back inside father's house, the old man's words were few before he grabbed Malik by the collar, pulled him to the basement door, opened it, and then threw Malik inside as if he was tossing a lamb to the wolves. Now that Malik remembered it, the old man had been calm the entire time, perhaps too calm. In the 6 months that he lived at father's house, Malik had never before been inside the basement. In fact, he hadn't known there was a basement. Now he was descending into the bowels of Father's house. What did the old man have in store for him down here? He froze in place as a blanket of dread draped over him. He remembered that Father's house was connected to Uncle Mayo's funeral business. It wasn't exactly a frightening thought, as Uncle Mayo had never shown any ill will toward him, certainly not of the magnitude of causing his death or dismemberment. Still, right now, being in the vicinity of a funeral home where handling dead bodies was commonplace and its owner was more than a little upset with him was unsettling. After a moment, he pushed the crazy thought aside and got his legs moving again, gingerly creeping downwards as if trying to avoid possible landmines. After a couple of steps, a smell assaulted his nose. The strong stench was almost recognizable, though he couldn't quite place it. The first thing that came to mind was his grandfather's hog farm. Those big nasty hogs could be smelled from miles away. The hogs would spend the day rolling about in slop and their own crap, oblivious to their foulness or simply uncaring. He had often wondered if a part of them, knowing their fate, had created such stinky chaos as a way of slinging one last odious shot at his grandfather. He descended a few more steps. Then it hit him. He knew exactly what it was that he smelled. The thought made him as nauseous as the smell itself. Had a toilet overflowed down here? Was he expected to clean up the mess? As he continued timidly down the remaining steps to the basement floor, he began to feel somewhat better. Cleaning up crap was gross, but gross he could deal with. He reached the last step and braced himself. He needed to stay at Father's house, and if this was what it was going to take, then so be it. But he wasn't going to promise not to sell drugs. He still needed the money. Besides, it wasn't something he planned to do forever. He just needed money to get his grandfather's farm back. That farm was his birthright. The farm hadn't made his grandfather rich, but it had made him free. He'd answered to no one but himself. It was the kind of life that Malik had come to respect. He too would one day work his grandfather's farm, his farm. He would work his own hours, live his own way. But first, he needed money to make that happen. As if on cue, an intercom crackled from somewhere in front and above him, issuing a deep voice that sounded birthed from a barrel. Do not let your heart be troubled. Trust in Father. Trust in me. In Father's house there are many rooms. If it were not so, I would tell you. A place is prepared for you. Come, trust in Father. Leek remained still. The voice stopped, and the room returned to an almost eerie quiet, except for a muffled creak coming from somewhere in the walls. It sort of sounded like a mouse was caught in a trap. A desire to flee surfaced. Leek turned his head around, looking back up the stairs he'd just come down. He could barely see the steps in the darkened stairway, but it didn't matter, since he quickly dismissed the thought anyway. He brought this on himself, and he would see it through to the end. Besides, running back up the stairs to pull on a door that was surely locked would be a childish waste of energy. Out of nowhere, a bit of anger bubbled within him as his thoughts turned briefly to Cain. The older boy was just as much to blame for his current predicament as Malik himself was. If only Cain would have allowed Malik to work for him instead of giving him that holier than thou bullshit about the dangers of selling drugs. Cain sold drugs. Cain made money. Why wasn't it okay for Malik? And it would have been, except Malik got caught. If only Cain would have shown him the ropes, taken him under his wings, taught him the tricks of the trade. But Cain hadn't. But that was just pissing in the wind now, he thought, his anger flaming out as quickly as it had risen. He'd been busted, fair and square. Luckily, Uncle Mayo had told him, I know the officers that nabbed you. If it would have been anyone else, you could have been removed from this house and thrown into the system, or worse, jail. Is that what you want? Of course it wasn't. He needed to be here at Father's house. He needed the roof over his head. And if coming down here in the basement, facing whatever there was to face would ensure he could stay, well then, that was what he was willing to do. Uncle Mayo had added, there will always be consequences for your actions. In the basement, you will face those consequences. Accept them, and you'll be allowed to stay here. Stepped onto the basement floor. Head started racing. He sucked in another deep breath, this time rushing it out. He tried to calm himself, to still his nerves. How bad could it be down here? Surely he wasn't the first to be sent to the basement. He was suddenly struck with the realization that the other drug-dealing boys of Father's house had also been sent down here. He was not a trendsetter. No one had been given a free pass. And out of that realization was born another. The others had survived. He hadn't heard of any broken bones or seen any burn marks on their bodies. He hadn't heard of any kind of torture happening at Father's house. That sort of thing would have surely gotten around. No, he was being indoctrinated into something. He felt it. This was a initiation of some sort. Of that, he was becoming increasingly certain. He was going to have to clean up crap or pass some other vile test. It would be nasty work, meant to be scary, but ultimately it would be harmless. The deep voice returned. Move forward 2 steps. Hesitantly, Malik did as commanded. He found himself in some sort of hallway. Ahead of him, a row of dimmed, recessed lights lined either side of the ceiling from where he was standing and ending at the other end of the hallway. He had the sense of being in a narrow tunnel. At the end of it, a flat-screen monitor suddenly materialized on the far wall. On screen, a digitalized computer head appeared. The head size glared at him. A few terror-inducing minutes passed by before the digital head spoke. It was Deep Voice. Turn to your left, it commanded. Leap turned to his left. The row of lights on the left side suddenly brightened. The sudden burst of light caused his dark-adjusted eyes to blink rapidly in water. After several seconds, his eyes readjusted to what was fast becoming welcomed brightness. He wiped away tears and looked. What he had assumed was a wooden wall was in fact the exterior glass wall of a room. He noticed to his right was a door slightly ajar. Inside the room, a spotlight flashed on, highlighting to his horror Nas Robinson. Nas Robinson was a flashy high roller, and though you couldn't tell by his current condition, an impeccable dresser. Inside the room, he was stark naked and dangling from thick braided ropes which ran through the pulley of a long metal crane which reached up to the ceiling. His body was tilted forward slightly in a hanging fetal position. His arms were banded to his chest while his legs were folded beneath him. A bucket was placed under his head, and another bucket was placed beneath his buttocks. His midsection was encased in some type of metal contraption that, judging by the pained look on the young man's face, caused him an extreme amount of displeasure. His classmate Khalid had introduced Malik to Nas just last week. Nas was going to be his ticket to drug riches. Nas was awash in money. He drove a custom-built SUV and never wore the same pair of sneakers twice. Do you know this man? The digitized voice was eerily calm, but was nonetheless threatening. Malik blinked several times in Nas's direction, as if trying to place him. Seeing Nas hanging like that made Malik realize that wasn't there just to clean up crap. His very life could very well be in danger. Suddenly he wanted to be a normal 11-year-old kid. He wanted to be somewhere else now, anywhere else, somewhere where a young kid should be, at a friend's house playing video games, or even at school recess playing what he used to consider a boring game, kickball. After a moment, a desire for self-preservation made him consider lying about any connection he had with Nas, but his lips wouldn't follow suit. He stammered, Yes, sir, I do." "How do you know him?" "Ka." He started to say Kylie's name, but suddenly regained control of his lips. Kylie had tried to help him get a gig. There was no need getting him mixed up in this. So he said, I don't, I don't know. Kids at school, they, they said he's a drug dealer." For the first time, Malik noticed that Nas was not alone. There was another man, a rather large man, in the room with him. Though Nas, who was perhaps about 10 years older than Malik, wasn't exactly a big fellow himself, the huge man behind the glass would have no doubt dwarfed most anyone. He was wearing a black metal studded mask that looked similar to an executioner's mask worn by one of Malik's video game characters. The gigantic executioner obviously did not like Malik's response to the last question, and he took it out on Nas. He turned the chrome handle that was connected by a long rod to the metal contraption. Nas grunted and then vomited in and around the bucket that was placed in front of him. The other end of his body, Malik saw the source of the horrid smell he'd first encountered coming down the stairs. Most of it hit the bucket, though drippings of it also dotted the floor around it. As Nas's bodily fluids trickled to stops at both ends, a ghastly moan escaped his lips. "Did you sell drugs for this man?" the digital head asked. "No," Malik answered quickly with the thankful truth, but the digital head's follow-up question came just as quick. "Did you try?" Malik hesitated, again, briefly considering lying. But then, with reasoning that belied his 11 years of life, he realized that if he and Nas were both there at the same time, then Digital Head most likely already knew the answer to that question. "I wanted to," Link answered in a quavering voice. "I tried to, but I was busted before I was able to make a sale. I just wanted to make some money. I just wanted to pay Uncle Mayo back for helping me, being so nice to me." He was talking fast and heard the shrillness in his voice. He knew he sounded like a scared little kid, but he didn't care. That's what he was, a scared kid. He hoped Digital Head would see that, understand that. Maybe Digital Head was Uncle Mayo, he thought hopefully. Maybe Uncle Mayo would let him go back to just being a kid. Digital Head said, "This man has no authority to sell drugs in Dooley. This is Father's territory. Understand?" "Yes, sir," Elite replied. Tears streamed down his face. "I'm sorry, Father." For a few minutes, Nas's whimpering was all that was heard. Then the digitized voice spoke again. "This fool has taken food out of my mouth and the mouths of my children. It's food I intend to get back one way or the other." Inside the room, the huge man walked over to a table that was lined against the back wall. He picked up a book from it and flipped through a couple of pages. He arrived at a spot and tapped it with his thick finger. "Nas Robinson," he said as he stared intently at the book, "for the crime of encroachment into Father's territory. Your name is listed in the book." Malik shook uncontrollably as he watched the masked man hold the black Bible-thick book in his enormous hands. After reading Nas's charges, he placed the book back onto the table and then walked back over to the metal crank. The fused sound of metal turning, bones crushing, and Nas's agonized shrieks soon filled the air, intensifying with each passing minute before abruptly ending, leaving only the sounds of Father's food being returned to him, drip by drip. Malik dropped to his knees and vomited. His childhood was now lost forever, and he knew it.